All right.
Oh yeah, almost everybody in here is a party to that conversation, aren't they? They just
Yeah.
We're good. We're
No,
going through
we're we're going.
financial peace.
Yeah, we're going through Financial Peace University. So, yep. And so,
Dave Ramsey stuff.
so we can't let Brad know that we've spent any money. That's right. I like that. I like that. All right. Well, we'll get started, and welcome to Truth Seekers. So one thing that we're going to be doing for the next probably 6 times we meet, we're going to be focused on the Constitution. We're going to be talking about the Constitution. So we're not going to be doing that all live. Most of that discussion will happen just with us. So I encourage you to come if you would like to. We'll be sharing some of the links as well that you can watch some of the videos. But I'm not going to talk for very long, but there are a couple of things. One that leads into the Constitution of why it's important that we even think about this, right? And especially as Christians. And I believe that because we should be involved in our government as Christians, because a biblical worldview encompasses everything, right? Then we should know how our government was originally designed to work, right? And so be able to look at that through a biblical framework. And frankly, we'll probably realize that we haven't functioned like that in a long time. But at least there's still a guideline there. But one thing I wanted to mention that to me is important. So y'all may not think this is a big deal at all. It does deal a little bit more overt politics, dealing with election. We don't talk overtly about that a lot, but it's a reality. But I heard some comments this past weekend from President Trump, or former President Trump, and it was in regards to abortion. And one of the things that has really impacted me over the last few years is and I had a sermon series on it of different strongholds of the enemy, that the enemy uses as strongholds in our society. And because I'm seeing some of those strongholds emerge, that's, to me, is evidence that we're in a heightened spiritual battle time. We've been talking about that for a while. And so when I hear comments that connect with those strongholds, I always think, hey, that's something we need to at least be thinking about. And one of the things with President Trump, and I think most of us in here, and I know I for sure, have a very complicated relationship with this gentleman that I've never met and never will meet, right? But just very interesting. It's very tough. He was a unique individual. No one really knew what to expect. No one knew if he was conservative or not. But then, especially in 2016, he ran a very conservative talking points and then governed pretty conservatively overall. One of the things that I talk about as a stronghold is the issue of abortion, and especially the change in abortion. In our country, we saw one where that used to not be an option. Then it became an option with a kind of an interesting court decision. But then it was still, even at that point, it was considered this is something that should be safe, legal, and rare. So there was an acknowledgement that, okay, it's legal, but it's still not a great thing. We shouldn't be encouraging it. Well, now we've moved, or many have moved the complete other direction now and said it's something to be celebrated. It's actually a moral good. People have made that case, and that there should be no restrictions at all. Well, that's pretty extreme the other way, and I acknowledge that our society right now would consider my viewpoint extreme. I believe that is a life, right, at moment of conception, because I don't know when else you make it. If you don't make it at moment of conception, you really have to make it at point of birth, right? To me, those are really the only two options. And I know we try to argue finding a middle point, but logically it doesn't work. But our country is not ready for that completely. But one thing that President Trump did that I really appreciate is he openly said he would nominate justices that he believed would, if given the opportunity, would overturn Roe versus Wade. And he did that. And they did overturn Roe versus Wade. The reason that they were doing it, because you can't just say, okay, Supreme Court, hear this, right? There has to actually be a case. So there were a state, I believe it was Mississippi, that passed a heartbeat bill, right? So it was basically a 6-week or whenever you can hear the heartbeat. Well, that, of course, went against, the established law. So lawsuits came, and then it just kept going up and finally got to the extreme Supreme Court. And that allowed Roe versus Wade to be overturned, which, by the way, did not outlaw abortion, did not stop abortion. It just put everything back in the hands of the states. And so now we really should rethink our strategy. We need to be strengthening pro-life states and bringing it to the states. And we're not doing a good job of that, by the way, because there are some states that have passed better abortion laws but there have been those that are now more permissive than they were before Roe versus Wade. And we just seem to not care. It's weird. But anyway, President Trump was being asked about this, and he was asked about a 15-week national ban on abortion, if he would support that or not, because that's kind of been floated out there, which, by the way, would go against the decision that the Supreme Court just made unless you do pass as a law, right? You can't just say this is what we're going to do. And it was really frustrating because what he did is he showed how transactional he is and not principle-minded. And that worries me, because I believe these strongholds are important in that they are dangerous to our society. And we need to stand up against those strongholds. Now, you can have different strategies of how you want to go about the abortion debate, right? That's one thing, and we can disagree on that. But he was asked about the 15-week, and he was like, oh, I think everyone would agree with that, which is completely out of touch, not understanding what a pro-life person would want. But then he was asked about the heartbeat bills, and he specifically mentioned, shockingly, some different governors who have not endorsed him, but have signed heartbeat bills, which is the reason he was able to fulfill the promise of Roe versus Wade being overturned, is because of those heartbeat bills. And he said, those are terrible. Now I believe that he is not principled on this issue. I believe it was transactional. I believe he knew to get the support of the right, he needed to be pro-life, and to do that in 2016. And he did, and guess what? He kept his promise. He said, you vote for me, this is what I'll do. And he did, and hey, he gets credit for that. But it's not a principled stance, because now the transaction is going the other way, right? And I think those are things we need to think about, that it's hard having a biblical worldview, right? That we need to understand what these principles are. And this doesn't mean that you can't support or vote for former President Trump. But it was a very disappointing thing for me. And I think it's something very important, because we are seeing idolatry within our political system from all sides. We are seeing idolaters towards a leftist, Marxist, kind of religion, right? A philosophy of governance. There's definitely an idolatry there. We're also seeing idolatry towards certain individuals within the more conservative side. we need to be honest, and as people who are trying to come at things with a biblical perspective, we need to be willing to say, no, that is wrong, and push back against that. And the reason I bring this one is this is a big one to me. Like this is one of those strongholds, right? Like this is not tariffs. This is not certain economic things. The fact that we celebrate abortion is an abomination, and it eats at the soul, I believe, of a society, and we need to stand up against that. I understand that we shouldn't support, or we shouldn't try to press a full ban on it across the board, because that's not where we are right now as a country, but that's the direction I believe we need to be moving. And it was disappointing hearing that, and just make sure you can say that, and you can still vote for him, right? You can still support him, but at least don't be an idolater. I'm seeing too much of that on the conservative side. Do not be an idolater. God is the only one who is infallible. He is the one that we put our trust in. No matter who wins the Republican nomination or the presidency, that is not going to save us. It could make things worse, yes, but it's not going to save us. A spiritual revival, a recognition of our need for God is what will save us. Now, I want to transition, and you may think there's not really a transition to this, but we're going to be talking about the Constitution. And I believe that the Constitution actually was set up because people believed in God and wanted to keep God as an authority and not the government. So the Constitution was created in order to check the power of the government so that it could not replace God. Because everybody is in a theocracy. Every country is a theocracy. We don't think of it that way, but you are either acknowledge that God is the first and foremost, and everything else falls under him, or you don't acknowledge that, and so what becomes God? What is the most powerful human institution or structure that we have? It is government, right? So then that becomes God. So that's what I mean by a theocracy. You either acknowledge that there is a God, and so you want to limit government so it doesn't become God, or government becomes God. The Constitution was a brilliant way of limiting government. And now what we are seeing, one, we're not following it the way that it was designed, but we're actually seeing an overt actions to try to change it, to dismiss it, to say we just need to move on. And this is an article. These two guys are from Harvard, so obviously they're smarter than all of us. And I just thought this was interesting. And one thing that I've been hearing the last 4 years is the attack on democracy. We need to protect our democracy. You hear democracy, democracy, democracy. Even you had, whenever we went to Iraq, back in the early aughts. How do you say that? I don't know. The 2000s, right. One of the selling points, if you will, was we're going to go and take democracy to these. And it's like, why would we do that? We're not a democracy, right? We are a republic, and a democracy is extremely dangerous. But we're seeing that being, talked about all over the place. Listen to some of these. They just wrote a new book, and it's called Tyranny of the Minority. I have not read the book. It says this is how it starts off. The U.S. Constitution desperately needs updating, says Harvard government professors Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. It says we have a very, very old Constitution. In fact, the oldest written Constitution in the world. They are completely accurate on that, and I think that's something we should celebrate and say, wow, that's really resilient. Maybe we should learn from it. However, they say it was written in a democratic era. It hasn't been amended much compared to other democracies. As a result, we have these institutions in place that most other democracies got rid of over the course of the 20th century. All right? So now, I mean, you can dismiss the fact that these guys are from Harvard and stuff like this, but this is one of our highest institutions that we have, right? And they are in the government teaching element of it. Couple of things that I thought was very, very interesting. The question, you write that the U.S. institutions have fallen out of step with our peer democracies. What are some examples of this? So all through here, the word republic is never used. So their premise is that we are supposed to be a democracy. So actually, they are correct that we do have institutions that are keeping us from being a democracy, which was intentional. They are making it sound like that it's because it was a pre-democratic era, we didn't understand what democracy was. No, our founders knew full well, and they did these things to keep it from happening. But I thought this is, so what are some examples of these things? Our independent judiciary and our Bill of Rights are two examples. So they go right to the Bill of Rights and say, this is an example that keeps us from being a true democracy. And then, of course, they focus on the Electoral College. That's what most of this is about, that how ridiculous it is. That's what they say. He says, I want to emphasize that Steve and I are not advocates of untrammeled majorities, but the combination of all of these institutions leave the U.S. in a situation where majorities have a harder time governing than any of our peer democracies, including many that, according to all metrics, are more vibrant democracies than our own. And they use democracies in South America as examples. I mean, wow. This guy says the United States did not become what contemporary political scientists would call a democracy until 1965. Isn't that interesting that their perception is that that's when we actually started to become a democracy? And their premise is that now these crazy Trumpers and Republicans and people like us that think the Constitution is valid, that we are trying to destroy the democracy that was created in the 1960s. It says, this was a question. You note that our Constitution, drafted in a pre-democratic era, inspired many nascent democracies, but other governments have done more to update their Constitution. What are some key reforms you've seen elsewhere? And basically, he says that nearly all other democracies have gotten rid of any kind of electoral college. They have moved to where it is majority rule on things. And there's a few other things in there, but I thought that was important because we need to understand what the Constitution is, what it says, but also why we need it. And that is terrifying. And if you don't understand the danger of a pure democracy, you don't understand human nature, right? Because mob mentality is extremely dangerous, right? You see this in Scripture, right? Whenever Jesus enters into Jerusalem for the last time, you see, first off, what does it do? In a sense, the mob mentality. They start worshiping. They're excited that Jesus is coming in, and people get caught up in that, right? Not even necessarily knowing fully what they are celebrating, but it just started spreading. It actually said the whole city was kind of up in arms. Well, this terrified the religious leaders, and so what did they do? They started a mob mentality the other way. And so once they were able to have Jesus arrested, and then they put him up with a known zealot, right? And it says they go up and they stir out the crowd to get the crowd going. And all of a sudden, people that were worshiping Jesus as Messiah are now asking for Barabbas to be released and Jesus to go to the cross. Do you see there's danger in the mob mentality? That is what democracy, pure democracy is, which is why we are a republic and not a pure democracy. All right, thanks for joining us. And again, we'll be putting out some information about the Constitution, but I encourage you to read it. It's not that long. And let's make sure that we stand up to keep the Constitution.